My name is Maris Davenport, and I am 28 years old. Last Tuesday, while I was 3,000 miles away on a business trip, my mother changed the locks on my grandmother's $2 million historic beach house. She hammered a developer sign into the waterfront lawn, posted a photo of it online, and invited her country club friends to celebrate her sudden inheritance. She expected to bulldoze a century of our family history before my return flight even landed. What she did not expect was that the house did not belong to her, and the single manila folder sitting in my hotel safe was about to cost her everything she valued. Welcome back to Fluffy Revenge, where quiet boundaries change everything and the truth always gets the last word. Before we get into how a single sheet of paper stopped a demolition crew, please drop a comment and tell me your age and where you are watching from today. I read every single one. To understand my mother, you need to understand Annapolis. Evelyn Davenport is a woman whose entire identity rests on the perception of generational wealth, yacht club memberships, and pristine optics. When my grandmother Lenora passed away 3 weeks ago, our family fractured exactly along those lines. I spent the last 4 months of Lenora's life driving to the Eastern Shore, managing her hospice nurses and reading to her on a porch overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. Evelyn managed her grief differently. She treated the memorial service like a networking event for local politicians and luxury real estate brokers. She accepted condolences wearing black silk with the practiced grace of someone navigating a minor public relations issue, rather than a profound loss. The text message arrived while I was sitting in a windowless conference room in Seattle, listening to a keynote on data architecture. It was from Mr. Gable, a retired waterman who lived on the adjacent plot. His message was brief. He said contract were at Lenora's place changing the locks, and there was a new sign in the yard. Below the text was a photo of the 150-year-old maritime salt box. Right in the middle of the green lawn sat a black and gold sign for a luxury development group known for tearing down historic properties to build sterile mansions. I did not gasp. I did not excuse myself to the restroom to cry or call my mother to demand an explanation. I am a software developer. When a system throws an error, panic is an inefficient use of resources. You isolate the trace the logic, and rewrite the script. Evelyn had waited until I was across the country, assuming geography and grief would keep me slow. She thought I was just a girl who typed code for a living, oblivious to the mechanics of property law. I closed the keynote presentation. I opened a new browser window and logged directly into the Maryland Department of Assessments and Taxation portal. I typed in the parcel identification number, letting my fingers do the work. The search results populated on my screen in stark black text showing the status of 14 Chesapeake Cove had updated to active escrow. My mother was liquidating my grandmother's legacy, but she had failed to read the final line of the deed. The Maryland Property Tax Portal is an archaic piece of software. It refreshes at an agonizing the interface is clunky, and most citizens give up trying to navigate its labyrinth of municipal submenus. 2 years ago, when my grandmother started losing track of her physical mail, I wrote a lightweight web scraping script to pull her assessment data automatically. It ran silently in the background on a private server I rented for $5 a month, programmed to send me a direct notification if any municipal flags, permit requests, or tax liens hit her specific parcel. It was designed as a digital safety net meant to protect her from bureaucratic clerical errors or forgotten utility bills. I never intended to use it to catch my own mother committing real estate fraud. I opened the raw data logs provided by my script, reading the plain text output. The transaction details were buried deep in the pending transfer queue, shielded behind a generic holding company name. Identifying the registered agent took me less than 3 minutes of cross-referencing state business registries. The buyer belonged to a notorious luxury development syndicate operating out of Bethesda. Their entire business model consisted of purchasing historic maritime properties along the Chesapeake Bay, bulldozing the old-growth timber frames and imported slate roofs, and erecting sterile glass-fronted boxes that resembled contemporary art museums rather than homes. They had a reputation for clearing lots with ruthless efficiency, erasing the natural topography and the architectural heritage of the Eastern Shore in a single afternoon. If this sale went through the wraparound porch where Lenora had taught me to read the original heart pine floors, and the custom maritime weather vanes would end up in a landfill by next weekend. The data showed this was an all-cash transaction. The closing date was set for exactly 7 days from today. Evelyn had negotiated a timeline specifically designed to outrun my return flight. She knew my tech conference mandated my attendance until Friday, giving her a clean window to finalize the paperwork. Hand over the keys, and let the demolition crews roll in before I could physically stand in her way. I leaned back in my hotel desk chair. The glowing digital clock on the bedside table read 3 in the morning. The Seattle rain beat a steady rhythmic drum against the thick glass of my window. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, settling into a bitter, muddy sludge at the bottom of the paper cup. I took a sip anyway. The caffeine was a secondary requirement. The primary need was the grounding ritual of the bitter taste. Most people discover their family is betraying them, and they shatter. They call their friends weeping. They throw objects across the room. They demand answers from a silent universe. I stared at the escrow timeline ticking down on my monitor, perfectly regulating my emotions by treating my family's betrayal as a critical system error. When a complex program fails, you do not yell at the monitor. You read the error log. You find the corrupted line of code. You isolate the bug. Evelyn is greedy, but she is also deeply lazy. A 7-day off-market, all-cash sale meant she was accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars below market value. You only leave that much equity on the table if you are terrified of the clock. She needed liquid capital, and she needed it by next Friday. I opened a new browser tab, shifting my focus away from the property records and into the state civil court dockets. If Evelyn was the architect of this disaster, my older brother Trent was the structural flaw that caused it. Trent is 32 years old and calls himself an entrepreneur in his social media biographies. In reality, he is a professional dependent. He has spent his entire adult life launching lifestyle brands that fail quietly and expensively. His latest venture was a bespoke sailing apparel company that outsourced its manufacturing while maintaining a flagship retail lease on Main Street in downtown Annapolis. Trent liked the aesthetics of business. He liked the tailored linen suits, the networking lunches at the yacht club, and the ribbon-cutting ceremonies with local politicians. He just despised the actual arithmetic required to sustain those ventures. While I had spent my teens and 20s learning syntax logic and self-reliance, Trent had learned how to charm his way out of deficits, always relying on Evelyn to smooth over his financial craters. During Lenora's final months in hospice, Trent had visited her bed exactly twice. Both times he wore a designer watch he could not afford, smelled of expensive gin, and spent the visit checking his phone while Lenora tried to hold his hand. My script queried his name across the judicial database, scanning for recent filings. The returns flooded my screen, painting a bleak, undeniable financial landscape. 3 active lawsuits from unpaid textile suppliers. 2 judgments from commercial landlords, demanding immediate back rent. And nestled deep in the commercial filings were a series of uniform commercial code liens. Trent had borrowed against his business inventory, and when that dried up, he had taken out predatory mezzanine loans with interest rates that guaranteed a default. I pulled up a calculator application and tallied the figures, double-checking the math, just in case my exhaustion was playing tricks on me. It was not. My brother had quietly accumulated $800,000 in catastrophic debt. His creditors were not sending polite warning letters anymore. They had filed the preliminary paperwork to seize his personal assets and freeze his accounts. The logic puzzle clicked together with sickening clarity. Trent was on the verge of public bankruptcy. To Evelyn, image was a tangible currency. She treated social capital with far more reverence than she treated her own family. The idea of her friends discovering her son's insolvency would be a social death sentence. If Trent's country club peers discovered he was insolvent, Evelyn's carefully curated standing would evaporate overnight. She could not stomach the idea of her friends whispering about her son's failures over Sunday brunch. So she had orchestrated the rushed sale of my grandmother's pristine estate. She was liquidating a century of our heritage to cover Trent's toxic lifestyle and hide his failure from her friends. She planned to wire the proceeds to his creditors to settle the debts, quietly expecting to pocket whatever cash remained to fund her own lifestyle. They were burning down our history to keep Trent warm. A familiar heavy coldness settled behind my ribs. I had spent 4 months watching Lenora fade, administering her pain medication and listening to her stories about the Bay, while my mother and brother were apparently measuring the curtains for a fire sale. Evelyn had complained about the cost of the visiting nurses during that time, suggesting we move Lenora to a cheaper facility so the estate funds wouldn't be drained. I paid for the nurses myself, quietly covering the invoices so Lenora could die looking out at her own water. Knowing now that they were plotting to sell that very water out from under her memory made my hands go numb. They saw the 150-year-old salt box not as a repository of memories, but as a piggy bank waiting to be smashed. But Evelyn had made a fatal miscalculation. She assumed the legal authority she once held over Lenora's affairs was still intact. She assumed her old documents would bully the title company into compliance, pushing the sale through before anyone could ask difficult questions. She had forgotten that I do not leave vulnerabilities in my systems. Sitting in the quiet hum of the Seattle hotel room, I minimized the browser windows. I opened an encrypted folder on my desktop. Thinking back to a crisp afternoon 14 months ago when my grandmother and I took a very quiet drive. 14 months ago. The air off the Chesapeake Bay carried a sharp winter chill on the afternoon. My grandmother received her terminal diagnosis. The oncologist was a kind man with tired eyes, and he gently explained that the timeline was uncertain. We had anywhere from 4 to 18 months. Lenora did not cry. She did not ask for a moment alone to process the grief. Instead, she sat perfectly upright in her clinic chair, smoothed the fabric of her wool skirt, and asked a singular, pragmatic question. She wanted to know the exact statistical probability of cognitive decline. She needed a guarantee that her mind would remain intact long enough to secure her affairs. Lenora was a woman carved from the very maritime timber that built her home. She possessed a terrifying clarity about the people she loved, and she knew exactly who her daughter had become. Evelyn viewed the historic waterfront property not as a repository of family memories, but as an uncashed lottery ticket. She saw the antique heart pine floors and the custom weather vanes only as equity waiting to be extracted to fund her Annapolis social climbing and subsidize Trent's endless string of failed business ventures. Lenora had watched this entitlement fester for decades. She saw how Trent bled his mother dry with expensive car leases and hollow lifestyle brands, and she recognized that the moment she drew her last breath, Evelyn would gladly feed our heritage into a wood chipper to maintain her standing at the yacht club. Lenora refused to let the house where she had raised her children become collateral for country club dues and unpaid vendor invoices. 2 days after the oncology appointment, Lenora called me while I was debugging a software deployment. She instructed me to take a Friday off work, rent a quiet sedan, and drive her into town. We did not go to the family attorney who handled her standard tax filings. Instead, we drove across the Bay Bridge into the heart of Annapolis, pulling into the reserved parking lot of a specialized maritime and preservation estate lawyer named Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher operated out of a converted historic brick building that smelled of old parchment and lemon oil. He was a meticulous practitioner who built legal structures designed to withstand century-level storms, both meteorological and familial. Sitting across from his heavy mahogany desk, Lenora laid out her intentions with the cold precision of a military tactician drawing battle lines. She did not shed a tear. She spoke with the authority of a woman defending her sovereign territory. She instructed him to draft a Maryland generational land trust. This is not a standard revocable living trust that families use to avoid probate court. A generational land trust is an ironclad legal fortress, a highly specific vehicle designed to shield historic waterfront properties from being liquidated by irresponsible heirs or aggressive developers. It requires strict conservation compliance and severs the property from the individual's personal estate. Once executed, the dirt and the structures on it belong to an entity that cannot be bought, sold, or bulldozed without triggering severe legal penalties. I sat quietly beside her, taking notes on a legal pad, as Mr. Gallagher explained the mechanics. The deed to 14 Chesapeake Cove would be legally transferred out of Lenora's name entirely, and placed into the trust. Once the transfer was recorded with the county clerk, Lenora, as an individual, would no longer own the house. The trust would own the house. And the most critical component of this architecture was the appointment of the trustee. Lenora looked at the attorney and named me as the sole, irrevocable trustee. She bypassed her own daughter. She bypassed her eldest grandchild. She handed the keys to her legacy to the 26-year-old software developer who spent her weekends running errands and checking server logs. I asked her if she was certain, warning her that Evelyn would unleash a firestorm of litigation if she found out she had been disinherited from the physical property. Lenora simply smiled a thin, weary smile. She anticipated the litigation. That was why she had insisted on a secondary layer of protection. Mr. Gallagher produced a formal revocation of power of attorney. 5 years earlier, after Lenora suffered a mild stroke, she had granted Evelyn a standard financial power of attorney to help manage utility bills and property taxes during her recovery. Evelyn had clung to that document ever since, treating it as a royal decree that gave her unfettered authority over the checkbook and the estate. We revoked it. The document was signed, witnessed, and stamped by Mr. Gallagher's paralegal. Evelyn's old paperwork was instantly rendered legally dead. To preempt any future claims that Lenora was confused or unduly influenced, we had visited a specialized geriatric psychiatrist that very morning. We secured a comprehensive medical capacity evaluation proving Lenora was of sound mind, fully oriented to reality, and making these decisions without coercion. The medical evaluation was clipped directly to the trust documents, sealing every possible loophole Evelyn might try to exploit. When we finally left the law office, the late afternoon sun was reflecting off the Severn River, casting long, golden shadows across the brick sidewalks. I walked Lenora to the passenger side of the sedan. Before she got in, she stopped. She held a heavy sealed manila folder containing the certified copies of the trust, the deed transfer, the revocation, and the medical evaluations. She placed the thick envelope into my hands. Her grip was frail, but her gaze was sharp as an oyster shell. I can still hear the exact cadence of her voice over the distant sound of boat engines in the harbor, cutting through the crisp spring air. "They will try to sell our history," she told me, her eyes locking onto mine with a fierce intensity. "You let them build their trap, and then you show them the lock." I promised her I would guard it with my life. I drove her back to the eastern shore, watching the water glitter through the trees, and then I took that manila folder home to my apartment in Baltimore. I placed it inside a fireproof safe bolted to the floor of my closet. It has sat there undisturbed for 14 months, waiting for the exact scenario playing out on my computer monitor right now. I blinked, pulling myself out of the memory and back to the present reality of the Seattle hotel room. Outside, the rain continued to wash over the dark city, blurring the streetlights into smeared streaks of yellow. The glowing digital clock on the nightstand now read 3:30 in the morning. I stared at the encrypted digital scans of those exact documents on my laptop screen, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. The situation was no longer a tragedy. It was simply an equation waiting to balance. Evelyn was currently operating under a spectacular delusion. She was attempting to sell a multi-million-dollar maritime estate using a revoked 5-year-old power of attorney, blind to the fact that she possessed zero legal standing. She believed she held the winning hand because she was playing a game with marked cards, failing to realize she was sitting at the wrong table entirely. The luxury developer in Bethesda thought he was securing a prime waterfront lot for a fast-tracked demolition. Trent thought his catastrophic business debts were about to be forgiven by a generous maternal bailout. Evelyn thought her country club status was secure, and her bank account was about to swell. They were all marching confidently toward a precipice, trusting a bridge that had been dismantled over a year ago. My mother had constructed a fraudulent reality based on arrogance and a fundamental underestimation of my competence. She assumed my quiet nature was a symptom of weakness. She mistook my preference for code and logic as an inability to navigate the real world. She was about to learn that quiet people do not remain silent because they lack something to say. They remain silent because they are gathering data. But a significant legal hurdle stood in their way. The title company handling the developer's purchase would have run a preliminary title search upon receiving the escrow deposit. They would have seen the property was held securely inside the Maryland Generational Land Trust. Evelyn could not simply sign a standard deed transfer and hand over the keys. She had to bypass the trust architecture we had built 14 months ago. I queried the county clerk's pending transfer queue, searching for the specific escrow control number attached to the developer's holding company. I needed to see exactly what paperwork Evelyn had submitted to clear the title and push the sale forward. The system retrieved a scanned PDF of a sworn affidavit filed just 2 days ago. I opened the document and read the text. My pulse steadied into a slow, deliberate rhythm. Evelyn had attached her revoked 5-year-old power of attorney to the file. Below it, she had signed a sworn statement under penalty of perjury. The affidavit claimed that my grandmother Lenora had been medically incompetent when the trust was formed. It falsely declared the trust dissolved due to that incompetence and named Evelyn as the rightful executor of the physical estate. My mother had crossed the line from greedy opportunism to undeniable fraud. She had committed a felony. She forged a legal narrative to bypass a trust she clearly did not understand. She assumed the closing attorney would glance at the old power of attorney, accept the affidavit at face value, and push the wire transfer through to expedite the lucrative cash sale. I did not feel anger. I felt the sharp, focused clarity of a software engineer identifying the exact line of code that would crash a malicious program. The antagonists had built their trap, but they had handed me the very tools required to dismantle it. I saved the PDF of the fraudulent affidavit to my encrypted drive. I downloaded every court docket, every lien, and every judgment bearing Trent's name. I connected my laptop to the small portable printer I always carry for work conferences. The machine hummed to life in the quiet hotel room, spitting out crisp, warm pages of undeniable evidence. I treated the documents with cold, detached precision. I was compiling a fatal error log before a system crash. I took the printed pages and placed them inside a fresh manila folder, organizing them chronologically. The debt records went on the left side. The forged affidavit went on the right. This folder would soon join the certified trust documents currently resting in my fireproof safe back in Baltimore. The sun was beginning to rise over the Seattle skyline, casting a pale gray light through the rain-streaked window. The escrow clock was ticking down. The demolition crews were likely already mobilizing their equipment on the eastern shore. It was time to initiate contact and test the parameters of my mother's delusion. I picked up my cell phone and dialed her Annapolis number, preparing to let her speak her lies into the open air. The Seattle sky had lightened to a bruised purple by the time I picked up my cell phone. I sat on the edge of the hotel mattress, listening to the climate control unit hum. A low mechanical note against the damp morning chill. My laptop screen still glowed on the small wooden desk, illuminating the downloaded court filings and the forged title affidavit. It was a digital monument to my family's impending ruin, meticulously arranged in chronological order. I dialed my mother's Annapolis number. I did not rehearse a script or practice my breathing. When you hold undeniable data in your hands, you do not need to refine your delivery. You simply need to listen to how the target attempts to bend reality around the cold facts. The line rang 3 times before she answered. Through the receiver, I heard the unmistakable ambient noise of the Severn Sailing Club dining room. There was the polite clinking of heavy silver on fine porcelain, the low hum of affluent morning chatter, and the distinct sound of a waiter reciting a brunch menu. Evelyn was holding court. She was likely wearing her signature cashmere sweater draped elegantly over her shoulders, accepting mimosa refills, and exchanging pleasantries while her son's creditors prepared to dismantle his entire life. "Hello, darling." Her voice floated through the speaker, buoyant and coated in a practiced theatrical warmth. "Are you enjoying the rain out there on the West Coast? We have the most glorious sunrise over the harbor today." I kept my voice perfectly flat. It was the exact tone a machine uses to report a localized error protocol. I received a text message from Mr. Gable this morning. He mentioned there are contractors changing the locks on the Eastern Shore property. He also sent a photograph of a luxury developer's sign hammered into Lenora's front lawn. "Why is that sign there, Mom?" The background noise of the sailing club seemed to hush for a fraction of a second. When Evelyn spoke again, the buoyancy had solidified into something brittle and heavily sugared. She deployed the exact condescending pitch she utilized whenever a vendor challenged her authority, or a waiter brought her the wrong vintage of wine. "Oh, Maris, you always focus on the most trivial details. I am taking care of things. The adults are handling the estate. That house is nothing but a moldy burden. The roof is a legal liability. The foundation is sinking into the mud, and the upkeep is a financial black hole. I am doing this family a monumental favor by liquidating the property before it collapses into the Chesapeake Bay. I stared at the pristine architectural inspection report saved on my desktop completed just 6 months ago, which verified the structural integrity of the antique heart pine floors and the imported slate roof. The house was impeccable, a fortress built by shipwrights who understood how to weather centuries of storms. Evelyn was lying with effortless grace. She continued her tempo, accelerating as she built her narrative fortress. You sit behind a keyboard all day, sweetheart. You are a brilliant computer geek, but you simply do not grasp the complexities of high finance. Maintaining our social standing and preserving the Davenport legacy requires liquid capital, not a rotting museum piece filled with old furniture. The developer made a very generous cash offer, and I accepted it to protect us all from a looming tax nightmare. You should be thanking me for shielding you from the stress. She was weaving a tapestry of financial jargon she barely understood, hoping the terminology would overwhelm me into quiet submission. I let her finish her monologue. I allowed the silence to stretch across the cellular connection, letting the weight of her deception hang in the air between us. I am looking at the county property records right now, I said, maintaining the steady cadence of a metronome. It looks like a very fast escrow window. I was just wondering if this rushed timeline has anything to do with Trent. Specifically his $800,000 in defaulted mezzanine loans and the active eviction notice on his retail space. Are we selling Lenora's history to pay off his overseas textile suppliers? The sugary warmth vanished instantly. The silence on the line turned arctic. When Evelyn finally responded, her voice was a low, venomous hiss stripped of all country club refinement and maternal pretense. You have always been a jealous, bitter little girl. She spat the words into the receiver, prioritizing venom over volume. Your brother is an innovator. He takes risks. He builds things while you sit in a dark room typing code like a glorified secretary. He hit a temporary cash flow obstacle because the retail market shifted and you are taking sadistic pleasure in his struggles. You could never stand the fact that he belongs in our circles and you do not. She was attempting to strike every emotional nerve she had programmed into me since childhood. In the past, those accusations would have elicited a frantic, desperate defense. I would have argued, provided evidence of my own success, and begged her to see my perspective. Today, her words merely registered as irrelevant output. They were the desperate thrashings of a user trying to bypass a strict security protocol by pounding angrily on the keyboard. This is a private family matter, Evelyn commanded, her tone returning to a place of icy authority. You are to remain in Seattle. Enjoy your little tech conference. Do your job. I am handling the real estate transfer and Trent's corporate restructuring will be finalized by next week. I will not have you flying back here to throw a tantrum and embarrass this family during a delicate transition. Do you understand me, Maris? She demanded compliance. She expected submission. She required my physical absence to execute the final wire transfers and push the fraudulent deed through the title company before anyone could inspect the paperwork. She needed me to remain the quiet, obedient daughter who always stayed out of the way. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my career, my intellect, or my intentions. I simply looked at the glowing folder on my screen filled with the undeniable proof of her felony and delivered my response. I understand exactly what you are doing, Mom. I pressed the red icon on my screen and ended the call. Silence is a powerful weapon when deployed against people who rely on noise to survive. Evelyn would spend the rest of her brunch analyzing my final sentence, wondering if it was a capitulation or a threat. She would replay the interactions, searching for the emotional distress she usually provoked. By the time she decided how to interpret my calm demeanor, it would be far too late for her to change course. I did not go back to sleep. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to a commercial airline website. I typed in Baltimore Washington International Airport as my destination. I bypassed the standard economy options and booked a direct red-eye flight departing Seattle in 3 hours. I paid the exorbitant last-minute fare using my own credit card, watching the confirmation number appear on the screen with a deep sense of satisfaction. I stood up from the desk and walked over to my open suitcase. I did not pack with frantic energy or rushed movements. I folded my conference attire with methodical, deliberate precision. I placed my laptop into its protective sleeve, treating the hard drive like a loaded weapon. I gathered the freshly printed stack of court dockets, the forged affidavit, and Trent's debt records, sliding them neatly into a secure, waterproof compartment of my carry-on bag. My mother believed she had successfully marginalized me. She thought she could rewrite our family history with a forged signature, a fast-tracked escrow, and a condescending phone call. She assumed the structural integrity of her plan was sound because she had never bothered to inspect her own foundation. She underestimated the tenacity of a woman who spends her life ensuring that complex systems function flawlessly. I checked out of the hotel before the lobby breakfast buffet even opened. The taxi ride to the airport was quiet, the tires humming a low note over the wet asphalt. I watched the city lights blur past the rain-streaked window, my mind already mapping the exact sequence of events required for the coming days. The escrow timer was counting down, ticking steadily toward a Friday demolition. But the variable my mother had failed to account for was currently boarding a plane armed with a manila folder and a relentless commitment to the truth. The long flight east would give me plenty of time to refine the execution of her impending ruin. The descent into Baltimore Washington International Airport offered a view of the Chesapeake Bay, its gray waters reflecting the early morning light. I had not slept during the 5-hour flight from Seattle. Instead, I utilized the airline wireless internet to download Talbot County demolition ordinances and environmental review statutes. By the time the landing gear touched the tarmac, I possessed a comprehensive understanding of how quickly a luxury developer could erase a residential structure once they held a clear title. I bypassed the baggage carousel, carrying only my laptop bag and the secure briefcase containing my grandmother's trust documents. I secured a quiet rental sedan and navigated toward the highway, pointing the vehicle east toward the Bay Bridge. The drive across the suspension bridge marks a distinct geographical and cultural transition. The urban sprawl of the Western Shore fades, replaced by the deep maritime heritage of the Eastern Shore. The air here changes texture. It carries the distinct scent of salt marshland and damp earth. This region of Maryland is defined by its strict property laws and a deep reverence for generational land preservation. Families here do not simply sell their waterfront estates to the highest bidder. They pass them down through carefully structured legal entities to protect the shoreline from overdevelopment. My mother understood the social prestige of an Eastern Shore address, but she lacked the fundamental respect required to maintain one. She viewed the soil solely as a financial instrument to leverage whenever her son required a bailout. I turned off the main highway and navigated the winding tree-lined route toward Chesapeake Cove. The road is flanked by old-growth oaks and weeping willows, creating a natural canopy that filters the sunlight. As I approached my grandmother's property, the familiar crunch of crushed oyster shells beneath my tires announced my arrival. It was a sound I associated with childhood summers, a comforting acoustic signature of home. Today, that sound was drowned out by the harsh mechanical idle of a heavy-duty diesel pickup truck parked near the front steps. The physical reality of my mother's betrayal hit me the moment I shifted the car into park. The pristine, sweeping lawn that stretched down to the water was desecrated. A grid of neon pink surveying flags dotted the grass, marking out excavation lines and utility access points like a brightly colored infection spreading across the turf. In the center of the yard stood the sleek black and gold sign for the Luxury Development Syndicate, brazenly advertising a prime waterfront opportunity. Behind the sign, the 150-year-old maritime salt box stood in quiet defiance. Shipwrights had built this house using antique heart pine and imported slate. The structure had survived hurricanes, nor'easters, and a century and a half of coastal weather. It possessed a structural integrity that modern architecture rarely achieves. To see it marked for destruction by a company that specialized in erecting generic glass-fronted boxes felt less like a real estate transaction and more like an act of vandalism. I stepped out of my vehicle. A man wearing a high-visibility vest and carrying a digital measuring transit was pacing near the stone foundation. I approached him, keeping my demeanor neutral and my voice conversational. I did not introduce myself as the owner or the granddaughter. In systems engineering, you often gather the most valuable diagnostic data by posing as a standard user. I offered a polite morning greeting and asked if they were preparing for a renovation. The contractor chuckled, shaking his head as he logged a measurement on his clipboard. He possessed the candid, unguarded nature of someone who assumed the paperwork had already been finalized. I explained that there would be no renovation. The luxury developer had purchased the lot specifically for the dirt it sat on. The boss wanted to move fast, he told me. The demolition permits had been expedited through the county office thanks to an all-cash offer and a motivated seller. He pointed his pen toward the roofline detailing the schedule. The closing was set for Friday afternoon. His crew was instructed to roll the heavy excavators onto the lawn by Saturday morning. They planned to scrape the entire lot, tear up the deep foundation, and pour a new concrete pad by the following week. The abstract digital countdown on my hotel monitor had just materialized into a tangible physical threat. The ticking clock was no longer a theoretical concept. It was 48 hours away. I thanked the contractor for his time, wishing him a good shift. He tipped his hard hat and walked toward the shoreline to plant another neon marker. I turned my attention away from the diesel truck and walked slowly toward the wraparound porch. The wooden stairs groaned slightly under my weight, emitting a familiar musical note I had known since I was a toddler. I stood on the decking and leaned against the weathered railing. The smell of the brackish bay water drifted up from the cove, mixing with the scent of old wood and morning dew. I closed my eyes and pictured Lenora sitting in her favorite wicker chair, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon, holding a cup of tea while she explained the tide charts to me. She had entrusted me with this specific view. She had recognized that Evelyn would gladly trade this enduring sanctuary for a temporary infusion of cash to cover Trent's negligent business debts. The stakes had shifted profoundly in my mind. This was no longer merely a financial dispute over an unauthorized asset transfer. This was an existential defense of our history. My mother was not just stealing money. She was erasing the physical anchor of our family's past to subsidize a lie. The sheer arrogance of assuming she could bulldoze this heritage while I attended a conference on the opposite side of the country required a response calibrated to mirror her exact level of disrespect. I walked back down the porch steps and moved across the lawn toward my rental car. I stopped beside one of the neon pink surveying flags. The wooden dowel was driven deep into the soft coastal soil. I gripped the thin wooden stick and pulled it upward. The roots of the grass tore slightly as it came free. I held the bright plastic flag in my hands, feeling the cheap, flimsy material contrast against the solid, enduring nature of the saltbox house behind me. With a quiet, decisive motion, I snapped the wooden dowel in half. The sharp crack echoed briefly in the damp morning air. I walked to the trunk of my sedan, opened the lid, and placed the broken flag directly next to my secure briefcase containing the certified generational land trust documents. I closed the trunk, the latch securing with a heavy, satisfying thud. I was no longer operating as a grieving granddaughter trying to understand her mother's poor choices. I was the sole legal trustee of the Lenora Davenport estate, and I was preparing to defend my ground. The developer believed he had purchased a clear path to a lucrative demolition. Evelyn believed she had secured a clandestine bailout for her golden child. They were both relying on the assumption that the title company would process the paperwork without encountering friction. I got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and programmed the navigation system for the title agency in downtown Annapolis. It was time to introduce a fatal error into their transaction. The drive from the eastern shore into the heart of Annapolis takes roughly an hour if you avoid the Bay Bridge traffic. I utilized that hour to compartmentalize my focus. My mother believed she was executing a masterful financial maneuver. She thought she could outsmart the legal system simply because she possessed a convincing smile and a designer wardrobe. I parked my rental sedan in a paid lot near the historic harbor and walked the remaining 2 blocks to the address listed on the developer escrow filings. Chesapeake Title and Escrow occupied the 2nd floor of a renovated colonial brick building. The lobby smelled of expensive leather and polished brass. Framed nautical charts decorated the walls, signaling to wealthy clients that their maritime investments were in capable hands. I wore my standard daily uniform. I had on dark denim, a fitted charcoal blazer, and the same comfortable leather boots I had worn on my outbound flight, in a town where women often dress for afternoon tea before visiting the grocery store. I looked like someone dispatched to repair the office wireless router. I did not care about their aesthetic standards. I cared about the data. I approached the receptionist, a woman whose smile seemed permanently affixed to her face. I asked to speak with the senior escrow officer assigned to the Davenport transaction. She eyed my attire, her smile tightening a fraction of an inch, and asked if I had scheduled an appointment. I told her I possessed critical legal updates regarding a pending closing scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. She hesitated, clearly weighing my lack of pearls against my authoritative tone. She picked up her phone, spoke in hushed whispers, and gestured for me to sit in a velvet waiting chair. I did not sit. I stood by the window, watching the sailboats glide across the harbor, counting the minutes. 10 minutes later, I was ushered down a carpeted hallway and seated across from a man whose brass nameplate identified him as Richard Gable. Richard looked like a man who had spent 3 decades navigating the unreasonable demands of local aristocrats. He wore a starched blue shirt, a silk tie, and a deeply weary expression. He glanced at his gold wristwatch as I sat down, a silent indicator that my presence was an uninvited disruption to his lucrative morning routine. Title officers in Annapolis are accustomed to dealing with high-net-worth individuals who demand constant reassurance. Richard assumed I was a junior paralegal or a courier sent by the developer to drop off routine structural addendums. He did not offer me coffee. He did not ask how my morning was going. He simply folded his hands over his pristine desk blotter and waited for me to hand over the paperwork so he could return to his actual clients. I did not take offense at his dismissive posture. In software development, you learn early that user interfaces are often deceptive. You do not judge a system by its outward appearance. You judge it by the logic it processes. I unlatched my secure briefcase and withdrew the heavy manila folder. I opened it and laid the first document squarely on the center of his polished desk. It was the certified county-stamped copy of the Maryland Generational Land Trust. I kept my voice level and deliberate, stripping all emotional inflection from my delivery. I informed him that I was the sole legal trustee of the estate located at 14 Chesapeake Cove. I explained that the waterfront property he was preparing to transfer tomorrow did not belong to the individual named on his seller agreement. It belonged entirely to the trust resting under his fingertips, an entity designed specifically to prevent the exact transaction he was currently facilitating. Richard sighed, emitting a soft sound of professional irritation, and reached for his reading glasses. He told me that his office already possessed a sworn affidavit from Evelyn Davenport, claiming the trust had been legally dissolved due to medical incompetence. He stated that Evelyn held a valid financial mandate, and the closing was proceeding as planned without any need for my interference. I did not raise my voice to argue. Arguing is what people do when they lack empirical evidence. Instead, I slid the second document across the mahogany surface. It was the formal revocation of that specific mandate executed and notarized 14 months ago by a specialized maritime attorney. Next, I placed the comprehensive medical capacity evaluation, signed by a geriatric psychiatrist, on the exact same date. The medical record proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Lenora was of sound mind, fully oriented to reality, and legally capable of securing her legacy against her daughter. I watched Richard read the letterhead on the psychiatric evaluation. I watched his eyes scan the notarized signatures on the revocation form. The weary irritation on his face melted away, replaced by a sudden chilling alertness. He stopped looking at me like I was a courier. He started looking at me like I was a federal auditor holding a lit match near a powder keg. Richard opened his own locked file drawer and pulled out the thick dossier labeled with my family name. He laid Evelyn's fabricated affidavit right next to my certified trust documents. The physical comparison was devastating. He traced the dates with his index finger, his breathing shallow. The timeline was undeniable. He realized that the charming woman he had been dealing with for the past 2 weeks had lied on a sworn legal instrument. In the state of Maryland, filing a false affidavit to force a real estate transfer is a severe felony. Richard was a seasoned title officer with decades of experience. He understood the catastrophic liability his firm had just absorbed by processing this escrow. If he allowed the developer to wire funds and finalize the deed transfer tomorrow, his agency would be facilitating a severe financial crime. The title insurance policy would be void instantly. The luxury developer would sue his firm into oblivion for failing to perform basic due diligence. The color fully drained from his cheeks. He took a cotton handkerchief from his pocket and wiped a thin layer of sweat from his forehead. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. I sat perfectly still, offering him the silent space to process the failure of his internal protocols. He cleared his throat, his professional composure crumbling under the weight of the forged paperwork sitting on his blotter. He looked at me, his voice trembling slightly. He told me that he could not issue a clear title under these circumstances. He stated that the transaction was legally frozen as of this exact moment. The developer could not buy the land. Evelyn could not sell it. The demolition crews scheduled to arrive on Saturday morning to tear down the historic salt box would have to be turned away at the gate. The multi-million-dollar deal was officially dead on his desk. My mother's elaborate scheme had collided with an impenetrable wall of verified data. Richard reached for the heavy black telephone on his console. He announced that he needed to contact the buyer and Evelyn immediately. He wanted to cancel the closing meeting, halt the wire transfers, and initiate a formal fraud review with his legal department. I reached out and rested my hand lightly over the telephone receiver, stopping his movement. I looked directly into his panicked eyes. "Let them all show up tomorrow," I said, my voice as steady as code, executing perfectly without a single bug. Richard stared at me, bewildered, warning me that allowing the parties to gather under false pretenses was highly irregular and potentially volatile. I did not flinch. I explained that Evelyn and Trent had built a fraudulent reality relying on charm and deception to steal our family history. If he called them now, they would simply invent a new lie, hire hostile lawyers, and drag the estate into years of costly litigation. They needed to experience the collapse of their scheme in a formalized setting where they could not manipulate the narrative or escape the consequences. I wanted them to walk confidently into a room they would never financially recover from. I needed the developer to hear the truth directly from my lips, surrounded by the undeniable proof of my mother's forgery. I wanted the trap to snap shut when they were already sitting at the table. Richard slowly pulled his hand away from the phone. He nodded once, sealing their fate. The humid evening air in downtown Annapolis carried the distinct scent of the Chesapeake Bay, a mixture of salt diesel fuel from the harbor and roasted spices. I parked my rental sedan 3 blocks away from the waterfront and walked toward the restaurant. Evelyn had selected a historic, hyper-exclusive crab house, situated directly on the marina. It was the sort of establishment where state senators and generational wealth gathered to broker lucrative deals over silver platters of seafood. The valet stand out front was choked with imported sports cars and luxury vehicles. I walked past the attendant without breaking my stride, ignoring his polite offer to take my keys. I knew exactly where to find my family. My mother always booked the private dining room overlooking the water whenever she needed to orchestrate a performance for a captive audience. Through the glass double doors of the private suite, I observed the celebration before they noticed my presence. 12 people sat around a long, polished oak table under a nautical chandelier. Evelyn held court at the center, radiating a manufactured joy. She wore a tailored white dress holding a champagne flute, surrounded by members of her country club inner circle. Trent sat at the head of the table, his posture expansive and arrogant. Seated directly across from my mother was the luxury developer. He wore a crisp, unbuttoned collar and a sports coat exuding the casual, predatory confidence of a man who dismantles history for profit. They were clinking glasses, laughing loudly, and toasting the imminent destruction of my grandmother's legacy. I pushed the glass doors open and stepped into the room. The conversation died instantly. The clinking of crystals stopped. Evelyn turned her head, and for a fraction of a second, the polished socialite facade fractured. Her eyes widened, darting quickly toward the developer as her mind calculated the potential risk of my unexpected arrival. She had ordered me to remain in Seattle. She had assumed her condescending phone call had neutralized my interference. Seeing me standing there in my plain charcoal blazer and denim jeans introduced a variable she had not modeled for. But Evelyn possessed a terrifying talent for rapid social recovery. The mask slipped back in place, seamless and bright. She stood up, smoothing her dress, and pivoted immediately into managing the optics of the situation. She projected a sickly, sweet maternal warmth, announcing to the entire table that her daughter had surprised them by flying in from the West Coast. She approached me, placing a rigid hand on my shoulder, and leaned toward the developer with a theatrical stage whisper. She introduced me as the socially awkward computer programmer of the family, explaining that I spent my days hiding behind server racks and writing code. She offered a tight apologetic smile to her friends, painting me as a drab, eccentric relative who simply did not understand the sophisticated nuances of their world. She patted my arm, treating me like a stray animal that had wandered into a gala, hoping her condescending narrative would preempt any disruptive statements I might make. I did not flinch. I did not attempt to correct her or defend my career. Arguing with a delusion only gives it oxygen. I stepped out from under her heavy hand, walked to the far end of the long table, pulled out the only empty wooden chair, and sat down. Trent resumed his holding court at the head of the room, emboldened by the audience. He wore a bespoke navy suit that projected a level of wealth he did not actually possess. He gestured broadly, captivating the country club attendees with a fabricated story about his latest entrepreneurial venture. He spoke in loud, hollow buzzwords about maritime logistics and disruptive supply chains. It was a phantom business built entirely on vapor, designed solely to impress the developer sitting a few feet away. Trent flagged down the sommelier with a snap of his fingers, ordering 3 bottles of the restaurant's most expensive vintage reserve champagne. He explicitly instructed the server to place the entire evening's expenses on his personal tab. I was celebrating a windfall that would never arrive, spending the anticipated proceeds of a fraudulent real estate transaction to impress the very man who planned to bulldoze our heritage tomorrow afternoon. The developer chuckled at Trent's jokes, leaning back in his chair, clearly viewing my brother as a useful, easily manipulated fool. The antagonists were publicly flaunting their stolen wealth, celebrating the erasure of Lenora's estate, while actively insulting the person they were attempting to steal from. A waiter arrived, carrying a heavy silver tray piled high with bright red steamed Maryland blue crabs, setting it in the center of the table. A thick coating of spicy seasoning clung to the shells, while the rest of the party sipped their vintage champagne and exchanged hollow performative compliments. I pulled a large crab onto my ceramic plate. Extracting meat from a blue crab requires methodical surgical precision. You do not smash the shell blindly with brute force. You locate the natural fault lines, apply targeted pressure, and dismantle the structural integrity joint by joint. I picked up the wooden mallet and a small steel paring knife. I cracked the primary claw with a sharp, decisive strike. I extracted the lump meat, separated the swimmerette fins, and discarded the broken cartilage. I performed the task with silent mechanical efficiency. Trent raised his crystal flute, proposing a loud toast to new beginnings, lucrative partnerships, and the future of the Davenport legacy. The country club sycophants cheered, raising their glasses in unison. I did not lift my water glass. I did not look at him. I simply broke another claw, the sharp snap of the shell cutting cleanly through the ringing crystal. I sat quietly at the end of the table, my hands covered in spice, compiling the data points of their arrogance. I calculated the running total of the dinner bill in my head. Between the reserve champagne, the tiered seafood towers, and the private room reservation fee, Trent was racking up a tab well over $4,000. His overseas textile suppliers were currently drafting asset seizure documents, yet he was swiping a credit card to feed a room full of strangers. I knew with undeniable certainty that he was funding this charade using the non-refundable earnest money the developer had wired into Evelyn's account earlier that week. They were spending funds tied to a dead title. The dinner stretched on for 2 hours. I consumed my meal, methodically observing their celebratory theater without uttering a single word. Evelyn cast nervous glances in my direction, clearly unsettled by my silence. She preferred adversaries who yelled because yelling indicated emotional distress, and emotional distress could be manipulated. Silence offered no such leverage. Eventually, the waiter brought a heavy leather folio containing the final check, placing it next to Trent. My brother produced a thick metal credit card with a smug theatrical flourish, dropping it onto the leather pad. Evelyn beamed with manufactured pride. The developer stood up, shaking Trent's hand firmly, promising to see both of them at the closing attorney's office tomorrow at 2 o'clock sharp. I wiped my hands clean with a steaming lemon towel provided by the waitstaff. I stood up from the table, pushing my wooden chair in quietly. I did not say goodbye to the developer, nor did I acknowledge Evelyn's forced plastic smile. I walked out of the private dining room, navigating through the crowded restaurant and stepping back out into the humid Maryland night. The harbor waters lapped gently against the wooden pilings of the marina. I walked away from the valet stand, moving toward the dimly lit overflow parking lot where I had left my rental sedan. I knew Trent would not be far behind me. His fragile ego could not tolerate my silent dismissal in front of his audience. He would need to reassert his dominance out of sight of his mother and the developer. I leaned against the driver's side door of my car, staring out at the dark silhouette of the sailboats docked in the harbor, waiting for my brother to emerge and deliver the final piece of diagnostic data I required. The night air hung thick and heavy over the Annapolis harbor, carrying the distinct scent of salt spray and damp asphalt. I leaned against the driver's side door of my rental sedan in the dimly lit overflow parking lot, listening to the rhythmic clinking of halyards, striking the aluminum masts of the docked sailboats. The ambient noise of the marina provided a steady baseline while I waited. I knew my brother would not let my silent departure go unpunished. His entire psychological framework relied on dominance and the explicit validation of his superiority. By sitting at that dining table, refusing his expensive champagne and leaving without offering a single word of deference, I had introduced a glitch into his carefully curated performance. He needed to correct that error out of sight of his wealthy audience. The sound of leather dress shoes crushing the gravel announced his arrival before he rounded the corner of the brick building. Trent marched toward my vehicle with a heavy, hurried stride, closing the distance between us with predatory intent. The charming, magnanimous entrepreneur, who had just treated a room full of country club socialites to vintage reserve champagne, was gone. The mask had slipped, revealing the frantic, insecure man hiding beneath the bespoke tailoring. He stopped a few feet away, invading my personal space in a deliberate attempt at physical intimidation. Away from the flattering ambient light of the restaurant chandelier, the reality of his situation was painfully visible. His face was flushed, blotchy from the alcohol and the suffocating Maryland humidity. A thin sheen of sweat beaded along his forehead and gathered at his hairline. He breathed heavily, the scent of expensive gin radiating from his skin. My brother and I grew up in the same house, but we were raised in entirely different realities. While I spent my teenage years teaching myself programming languages and securing academic scholarships, Trent spent his youth learning how to manipulate Evelyn. He mastered the art of failing, upward adopting the mannerisms of a successful businessman, without ever cultivating the work ethic required to sustain a business. He viewed me not as a sibling, but as a dull, irritating reminder of the tedious labor he believed he was born to transcend. He pointed a rigid finger at my chest, his voice dropping into a harsh, venomous register. He demanded to know what I thought I was accomplishing by crashing his celebration. He told me I had no right to sit at that table, polluting his professional environment with my drab clothes and my silent, judgmental staring. He called me a bitter, isolated code monkey, claiming I spent my life staring at computer screens because I lacked the social grace to exist in the real world. He insisted I was suffocating under the weight of my own jealousy, unable to tolerate the fact that he was on the verge of a lucrative triumph while I remained a forgotten employee in a corporate cubicle. I stood perfectly still, resting my arms against the cool metal of the car door. I did not cross my arms defensively. I did not raise my voice to match his escalating pitch. I observed him with the detached precision of a software architect running diagnostics on a compromised server. I cataloged his micro-expressions. I noted the frantic darting of his eyes, the tightening of his jaw, and the slight tremor in his hands. He was projecting his own terror onto me. His insults were hollow, desperate attempts to convince himself that he was still in control of his collapsing narrative. Trent misread my silence as submission. Emboldened by my lack of a verbal counterattack, his arrogance surged, overriding his fundamental sense of self-preservation. He needed to prove his dominance, and to do that he needed to demonstrate the sheer scale of his victory. He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with condescension, and he offered up the very diagnostic data I had been waiting for. He told me I was too late to ruin anything. He bragged that the real estate transaction was already an unstoppable force. He explained with a smug, triumphant smirk that Evelyn had negotiated a specialized clause with the luxury developer. Because the buyer was desperate to secure the demolition permits and break ground before the municipal zoning laws shifted, Evelyn had convinced him to release a non-refundable earnest money deposit directly into her personal account to expedite the paperwork. Trent puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of his expensive navy suit. He revealed the exact figure: $150,000 in liquid cash wired 3 days ago. He laughed a dry, ragged sound and boasted that the money was already gone. He proudly admitted that he had intercepted the funds, utilizing the cash to instantly silence his most aggressive overseas textile suppliers and pay off the predatory lenders threatening to padlock his retail storefront. He framed this catastrophic financial maneuver as a stroke of entrepreneurial genius, a brilliant strategic move that had saved his lifestyle brand and secured his future among the Annapolis elite. I processed the data points as they fell from his mouth. The underlying mathematics of their scheme clicked into place, locking tight like a steel vault. My brother believed he was delivering a crushing blow, unaware that he was simply reciting a detailed confession to systemic fraud. In commercial real estate, earnest money is designed to sit safely in a neutral escrow account until the closing documents are signed and a clear title is transferred. Releasing those funds early directly to a seller is highly irregular. Spending those funds before delivering a legally binding deed is a catastrophic liability. By burning through $150,000 of the developer's money on a transaction backed by a forged affidavit and a dead title, Trent and Evelyn had crossed a point of no return. If the sale failed to close tomorrow, the developer would immediately demand the return of his deposit. When he discovered the funds had been squandered on bespoke sailing apparel debts, the situation would transition from a civil dispute into a criminal theft investigation. They had trapped themselves inside a financial snare they could not afford to open. The stakes were permanently locked. Trent finished his monologue standing tall, waiting for my reaction. He expected tears. He expected a frantic, panicked argument. He expected me to crumble under the crushing weight of his apparent victory. I looked at the beads of sweat dripping down his flushed temples. I looked at the tailored seams of his expensive suit purchased with stolen equity clinging to a man who was mathematically ruined. I did not yell. I did not threaten him with the manila folder resting quietly in the trunk of my car. I simply smiled, allowing the expression to remain cold and entirely devoid of warmth. "Make sure you wear that suit tomorrow, Trent," I said, my voice steady and measured, slicing cleanly through the humid night air. "You'll want to look your best for the developer." I turned my back on him before he could formulate a response. I opened the door of my rental sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I put the vehicle in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving my brother standing alone in the gravel, listening to the sound of my tires fading into the dark. The pieces were perfectly aligned on the board, and the final sequence was scheduled to execute in less than 18 hours. I drove back toward the eastern shore, my mind already shifting to the precise logistics required for tomorrow's assembly in the conference room. The morning of the closing arrived with a quiet, heavy stillness. I woke up in a modest motor lodge situated just off the main highway connecting the eastern shore to the Bay Bridge. I had rented the room late the previous night, preferring the anonymous, sterile environment of a commercial motel over the suffocating memories of my grandmother's house. I did not need nostalgia distracting me today. I required a controlled environment. I threw off the thin cotton blanket and placed my feet on the cold synthetic carpet. There was no cinematic montage of frantic preparation, no racing pulse, and no pacing across the floorboards. I moved with the grounded, deliberate routine of a highly competent professional preparing for a surgical strike. I walked to the small kitchenette and began brewing coffee in the generic plastic machine provided by the motel. The water hissed and sputtered, filling the room with the harsh, bitter scent of cheap roasted beans. While the liquid dripped into the glass carafe, I turned my attention to my wardrobe. In the Annapolis social circles, My mother-dominated clothing functioned as armor. Evelyn and her peers utilized silk scarves, imported linen, and rare pearls to signal their hierarchy, deploying fashion as a psychological weapon to intimidate outsiders. Growing up, my mother constantly criticized my practical attire, insisting that a woman must dress for the zip code she wishes to inhabit. I chose to dress for the reality I already occupied. I pulled on a pair of dark, sturdy denim jeans. I buttoned a clean, crisp white Oxford shirt and slipped a fitted charcoal blazer over my shoulders. I bypassed the delicate heels my mother deemed mandatory for formal meetings, opting instead for my comfortable, well-worn leather boots. They were the same boots I wore when crawling under server racks to trace fiber optic cables. They were designed for utility stability and enduring long hours on hard floors. I refused to adopt Evelyn's high society armor. By rejecting her aesthetic standards, I was rejecting her authority. I looked at my reflection in the cheap mirror mounted above the motel dresser. The woman staring back at me was not a frightened daughter or a grieving relative. She was a systems architect ready to deploy a critical patch. I poured the dark, bitter coffee into a styrofoam cup and sat down at the small laminate table near the window. I unlatched the secure briefcase I had carried from Baltimore and withdrew the heavy manila folder. I placed it squarely in the center of the table. This folder was no longer just a collection of legal documents. I treated the stack of paper as an executable script, a perfectly coded sequence designed to permanently crash Evelyn's manufactured reality. I needed to run one final diagnostic check before executing the program in the production environment. I opened the cover and laid the contents out in a precise chronological grid. I took a slow sip of the hot coffee, letting the caffeine sharpen my focus, and began my review. The first document was the certified deed transfer for the Maryland Generational Land Trust. The heavy bond paper felt substantial beneath my fingertips, bearing the raised, embossed seal of the county clerk. This single sheet of paper represented the impenetrable fortress Lenora had built to protect her legacy. It clearly designated me as the sole irrevocable trustee, granting me absolute jurisdiction over the waterfront estate. It severed Evelyn from the property entirely, leaving her with zero legal standing. Next to the deed, I placed the comprehensive medical capacity evaluation. The geriatric psychiatrist had documented Lenora's cognitive function with forensic detail. The physician noted her sharp memory, her acute awareness of her financial assets, and her explicit understanding of the actions she was taking to disinherit her daughter from the physical real estate. This evaluation was the antidote to the fraudulent affidavit Evelyn had submitted to the title company. It proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that my grandmother possessed a lucid, commanding intellect on the day she locked her trap. The third document was the formal revocation of the 5-year-old power of attorney. The signatures were stark and undeniable. The specialized maritime lawyer had executed the revocation with precise legal syntax, immediately terminating any financial mandate Evelyn once held. My mother was marching into a multi-million-dollar real estate closing, armed with a dead instrument, relying on a ghost of her former authority. Finally, I reviewed the freshly printed public records detailing Trent's financial ruin. I aligned the Uniform Commercial Code lines, the overseas textile supplier judgments, and the commercial eviction notices. The sheer volume of his negligence was staggering. The court stamps and the red penalty figures painted a portrait of a man drowning in his own arrogance. These pages explained the motive behind the rushed all-cash sale. They provided the empirical evidence of why Evelyn had resorted to forgery. She needed the developer's money to erase these specific debts and save her pristine social standing. Trent had already squandered the non-refundable earnest money deposit, spending $150,000 of stolen funds to temporarily quiet his creditors. That premature expenditure was the fatal flaw in their architecture. It transformed their greedy maneuver into an inescapable financial liability. I finished my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. A profound psychological transition solidified within me during that quiet morning hour. For weeks I had carried the heavy, suffocating weight of a grieving granddaughter, mourning the impending loss of a cherished childhood sanctuary. I had felt the sting of my family's betrayal, the sharp pain of knowing my mother valued her country club status over my grandmother's dying wishes. But looking at the undeniable data spread across the laminate table, the grief evaporated. It was replaced by an ironclad emotional detachment. I recognized that my power did not lie in righteous anger or tearful accusations. My power resided in absolute, verifiable documentation. I did not need to raise my voice to defeat them. I simply needed to present the data and allow the neutral parameters of the law to process the inputs. The legal system operates much like a compiler. It does not care about your charming smile, your designer suit, or your elite social connections. It only cares whether the syntax is valid. Evelyn's syntax was a catastrophic forgery. I gathered the documents, ensuring they remained in their precise sequential order. I placed them back into the manila folder and secured the clasp. I slid the folder into my structured leather laptop bag, treating it with the reverence a technician gives to a master key. I checked my wristwatch. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. The closing meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon at a prestigious law firm overlooking the Annapolis Harbor. I had exactly 4 hours to cross the bridge, navigate the downtown traffic, and position myself for the final sequence. I walked out of the motel room, leaving the keycard on the unmade bed. The Maryland air was crisp and bright, the earlier rain having washed the sky into a brilliant cloudless blue. I climbed into my rental sedan, placed my bag on the passenger seat, and turned the ignition. I drove onto the highway, merging into the steady stream of traffic heading west toward the Capitol. The drive offered me a final opportunity to review my strategy. Evelyn would undoubtedly attempt to control the room the moment I walked in. She would deploy her trademark condescension, attempting to paint me as an unstable, jealous relative trying to sabotage a legitimate business deal. Trent would likely resort to aggressive posturing, using his physical presence to intimidate me into backing down. The luxury developer would be impatient, focused entirely on securing his demolition permits and protecting his investment. I anticipated their reactions, mapping out the conversation tree in my mind. I would not engage with their emotional provocations. I would direct all my communication to the senior closing attorney, the only individual in the room, bound by professional liability and legal ethics. I arrived in downtown Annapolis an hour early. I navigated the narrow historic streets, passing the boutique shops and the upscale seafood restaurants where my mother spent her afternoons sipping white wine. I found a parking garage located 2 blocks away from the law firm. I parked the sedan, retrieved my bag, and walked out into the sunlight. The harbor was dotted with white sails, the water sparkling under the midday sun. I approached the imposing glass and steel building that housed the legal offices. The architecture was designed to project wealth and unyielding authority. I stood on the sidewalk for a brief moment, feeling the familiar, reassuring weight of the manila folder resting against my side. The trap was fully set, the logic was flawless, and the antagonists were already inside waiting to execute their own ruin. I stepped forward and pushed the heavy glass doors open, entering the cool, climate-controlled lobby to finish the work my grandmother had started. The law firm of Davis, Montgomery & Clark occupies the penthouse level of a prestigious glass and steel building overlooking the Annapolis Harbor. Stepping off the elevator, the environment is engineered to project unwavering authority and quiet wealth. The reception area smells of expensive coffee and leather bindings. The receptionist is engaged in a hushed telephone conversation, her attention diverted, so I bypass her desk without breaking my stride. I walk down a wide corridor lined with maritime oil paintings and frosted glass partitions. I do not need a guide. I know exactly which room they are utilizing. I reach the heavy mahogany double doors of the primary conference suite. I do not knock. I grip the polished brass handle and push. The room is flooded with natural light, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that frame the sailboat masts bobbing in the bay below. Around a sprawling, polished oak table sit the 4 individuals deciding the fate of my family history. Evelyn is seated near the head of the table, wearing a crisp ivory blazer and her signature pearl necklace. She holds a crystal water glass, laughing a bright musical laugh, holding court with effortless charm. She is weaving a grand narrative for the room, detailing her fictional plans to invest the sudden influx of cash into a philanthropic foundation, or perhaps a modest villa in Tuscany. It is a masterful performance of unbothered wealth designed to project stability, while hiding the festering rot of her son's insolvency. She smiles warmly at the developer, assuring him that the property transfer will be seamless and swift. Trent sits beside her wearing the exact same bespoke navy suit he wore at the crab house last night. His posture is rigid, an artificial display of confidence meant to mask the desperation underneath. He drums his fingers on the armrest of his leather chair, a silent tell revealing the anxiety simmering beneath his tailored exterior. He knows he has already squandered the developer's non-refundable earnest money deposit to appease his overseas creditors. He desperately needs the senior attorney to finalize the wire transfer today, or his fragile reality shatters into federal court proceedings. Opposite my family sits the luxury developer, a man with a deep tan, a heavy gold watch, and the impatient energy of someone accustomed to moving earth and making millions. He checks his phone repeatedly, likely coordinating with the demolition crew he currently has staged on standby near the Eastern Shore property. He cares nothing for the 150-year-old antique heart pine floors or the imported slate roof. He only sees a premium waterfront lot waiting to be scraped clean and paved over. At the head of the table sits Mr. Davis, the senior closing attorney. He is a distinguished older man with silver hair, meticulously arranging thick stacks of legal documents, settlement statements, and wire transfer authorization forms on his leather blotter. Resting near his right hand is the fraudulent affidavit. My mother submitted the forged document claiming my grandmother was incompetent. Mr. Davis operates under the assumption that this is a routine, uncontested cash transaction between a wealthy widow and a reputable builder. My entrance breaks the delicate social equilibrium of the room. The heavy mahogany door clicks shut behind me, the sound echoing sharply against the wood-paneled walls. Evelyn stops mid-sentence. Her bright musical laugh catches in her throat. For a fraction of a second, the polished socialite mask drops, revealing a flash of sheer, unadulterated panic. She had orchestrated this entire timeline around my physical absence, assuming I was safely trapped in a Seattle conference hall. Seeing me standing in the doorway, dressed in my practical denim and comfortable leather work boots, introduces a catastrophic variable she had not prepared to manage. But my mother is a veteran of social warfare. She recovers with terrifying speed. She stands up from her leather chair, smoothing the lapels of her ivory blazer, and attempts to seize control of the optics. She projects a tone of weary maternal condescension, apologizing to the developer and the attorney for the unexpected interruption. She turns her gaze toward me, her eyes hard and unyielding. "Maris, what on earth are you doing here?" Evelyn asks, her voice coated in artificial sweetness meant to mask the venom underneath. "I specifically told you to stay on the West Coast. This is a private financial matter. The adults are finalizing the estate, and we do not have time for one of your emotional outbursts." She gestures toward the door, silently commanding me to retreat. "Mr. Davis is a very busy man, and we are on a tight schedule. You need to leave this room right now. This meeting is restricted to the actual heirs of the property." Trent senses his mother's desperation and decides to intervene, hoping to assert his dominance and impress the developer. He leans forward, resting his elbows on the polished oak table, and adopts a sneering, arrogant tone. "You heard her, Maris," Trent says, his voice thick with unearned entitlement. "Go back to your server racks. You do not understand how real estate transactions work. You are just a code monkey trying to insert yourself into a high-level business deal because you want a piece of the payout. Stop embarrassing yourself and get out." The luxury developer frowns, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. He glances at his heavy gold watch and then looks directly at Mr. Davis. "Is there a problem here?" the developer asks, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I have a heavy machinery crew sitting on the clock across the bay. My guys are ready to tear that old house down at first light tomorrow. I need clear title and signed paperwork today, Evelyn, or I am walking away from this table." Mr. Davis clears his throat, adjusting his reading glasses. He looks at me with a mixture of professional curiosity and mild annoyance, unsure of how I fit into the legal framework of his afternoon. He assumes I am a disgruntled relative looking for a handout, a common hazard in generational wealth transfers. This is the exact environment Evelyn relies upon. She thrives in rooms where emotional manipulation, social hierarchy, and performative posturing dictate the outcome. She expects me to raise my voice to defend my career against Trent's insults, to plead with the attorney, and to act like a frantic, jealous sibling. If I engage in her theater, she wins. She will paint me as unstable, ask security to escort me out, and proceed with the felony. I do not engage. I do not raise my voice. I do not offer a single word of defense regarding my profession or my sudden return from Seattle. I treat their insults as irrelevant background noise, isolating the critical path required to execute my objective. I walk past my mother, ignoring her outstretched, commanding hand. I walk past Trent, ignoring his flushed, sweating forehead and his bespoke suit. I walk past the impatient developer. I move with calm, deliberate purpose toward the far end of the long mahogany table directly opposite Mr. Davis. There is one empty leather chair remaining. I pull it out, the casters rolling smoothly over the thick carpet, and I sit down. I maintain perfect upright posture. I place my structured leather laptop bag on the floor beside me. I retrieve the heavy manila folder. I set the folder squarely on the polished oak surface, resting my hands on top of the plain cardboard cover. The physical action is so quiet, so devoid of theatricality, that it forces the entire room into a suspended, breathless silence. The only sound remaining is the distant hum of the central air conditioning. Evelyn stares at me, her mouth slightly parted, unable to comprehend my refusal to play my assigned role. Trent looks at the folder, a flicker of genuine fear finally breaking through his arrogant facade. Mr. Davis folds his hands over his settlement statements, watching me with a sudden, intense focus. He recognizes the demeanor of someone who possesses verified empirical data. I look directly at the senior closing attorney, bypassing my family entirely. I speak with the clear, unyielding cadence of a system confirming a command. I am not an heir. I say evenly, my voice cutting through the heavy tension of the boardroom. I am the landlord. Evelyn emitted a laugh that echoed against the glass walls, sharp and brittle like shattering crystal. It lacked the musical warmth she routinely deployed at yacht club fundraisers and charity galas. She turned her gaze toward the luxury developer, offering a practiced, sympathetic sigh, attempting to weaponize maternal concern to neutralize the threat I presented. "Gentlemen, please forgive this bizarre interruption," Evelyn said, her tone dripping with manufactured pity. "Grief manifests in terrible, unpredictable ways. My daughter has struggled with accepting reality since my mother passed. She was very close to Lenora, and the loss has simply untethered her judgment." She placed her manicured hands on the edge of the mahogany table, leaning forward to project unwavering authority over the space. She looked directly at the senior attorney, dismissing my presence with a casual wave of her wrist. "Mr. Davis, let us proceed," she commanded, her voice tightening into a strict directive. "The buyer has heavy machinery crews waiting on the eastern shore. Print the final signature pages and initiate the wire transfers immediately. We do not have time to indulge these unfortunate delusions." I did not look at my mother. I did not offer a frantic defense of my sanity, nor did I raise my voice to argue against her character assassination. In the realm of software architecture, when a rogue user attempts to override administrative access using invalid credentials, the system does not argue. It simply denies the request and presents the security log. I kept my focus entirely fixed on the senior closing attorney at the head of the table. I lifted my hands from the plain cardboard cover of the manila folder. With a single fluid motion, I slid the heavy envelope across the polished oak surface. It glided silently over the wood, coming to a precise stop, resting against the edge of Mr. Davis's leather desk blotter. "Mr. Davis," I said, my voice maintaining the even, regulated cadence of a metronome. "I am the sole trustee of the Lenora Davenport Generational Trust. The property at 14 Chesapeake Cove is held entirely within this trust. It was recorded 14 months ago." The attorney froze. His silver fountain pen hovered an inch above the settlement ledger he had been preparing to sign. He was a veteran of Maryland property law, a man who had spent 3 decades navigating complex maritime estates and elite family disputes. He recognized the specific legal terminology I used. Generational land trusts were not the conversational vocabulary of a grieving, delusional relative. They were sophisticated, ironclad instruments of preservation. He lowered his pen, resting it carefully on the desk. He looked at Evelyn, whose tight smile was beginning to tremble at the corners. He looked at the impatient developer who was suddenly sitting very upright in his chair. Then Mr. Davis looked down at the plain folder resting in front of him. He reached out and opened the cover. The only noise remaining in the expansive sunlit suite was the heavy, crisp sound of legal paper turning. I watched his eyes scan the first page. It was the certified deed transfer bearing the raised embossed seal of the county clerk. The document proved indisputably that the waterfront estate had been severed from Lenora's personal assets over a year ago. It established the trust as the sole legal owner of the dirt, the structure, and the shoreline rights. Below the property description sat my name printed in stark black ink, granting me exclusive, irrevocable administrative authority over the land. Mr. Davis turned the page. Next was the comprehensive medical capacity evaluation. I had deliberately placed it second in the sequence to dismantle Evelyn's fabricated narrative. The attorney read the letterhead of the specialized geriatric psychiatrist. He reviewed the physician's sworn statement, which detailed Lenora's sharp cognitive function, her flawless memory recall, and her explicit understanding of the legal maneuvers she was initiating to disinherit her daughter. The medical professional had confirmed her sound mind on the exact same date the trust was executed. I watched the physiological reaction wash over the senior attorney. The healthy color drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin a pale ashen gray. His breathing turned shallow. Mr. Davis reached toward the right side of his desk, picking up the sworn affidavit Evelyn had submitted 2 days prior to initiate the escrow process. He laid Evelyn's paperwork side by side with the certified trust documents. He compared the dates. He compared the signatures. He looked at the revoked, outdated power of attorney my mother had used to claim authority over the sale. The contrast between the pristine, legally fortified trust and the fragile forged affidavit was devastating. In that singular moment, the power dynamic in the room shifted entirely. Mr. Davis realized he was not presiding over a routine, lucrative real estate closing. He was sitting at ground zero of a severe felony. Evelyn had submitted a fraudulent legal instrument under penalty of perjury to force a multi-million-dollar property transfer. If he had wired those funds, if he had authorized the title change, his prestigious firm would have been the primary facilitator of massive financial fraud. His license to practice law would have been suspended, his firm sued into oblivion by the developer, and his professional reputation erased. The attorney slowly placed his hands flat on top of the documents, treating the paper as though it were hazardous material. He did not look at Evelyn as a respected, affluent client anymore. He looked at her as a catastrophic liability. Trent shifted uncomfortably in his expensive, tailored suit. The arrogant bravado he had displayed at the Crab House the night before evaporated in the frigid silence of the boardroom. The temperature in the room had not changed, but a fine sheen of sweat broke out across his forehead. He tugged at his starched collar, struggling to draw a full breath. He recognized the gravity of the legal review occurring at the head of the table. My brother's eyes darted frantically toward the luxury developer. Trent had already intercepted the non-refundable earnest money deposit, spending $150,000 of the developer's cash to silence his overseas textile creditors. He had treated the money as a guaranteed windfall. Watching the closing attorney freeze the transaction meant the windfall was dead. The developer would demand the immediate return of his funds, and Trent's bank accounts were entirely empty. He was trapped. The developer leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He was a predator accustomed to controlling his environment, and he could smell the sudden scent of legal peril in the water. He did not know exactly what the paperwork contained, but he recognized the terrifying pallor on the attorney's face. His lucrative demolition schedule, his fast-tracked permits, and his entire investment were suddenly in severe jeopardy. I remained perfectly still in my chair at the end of the long mahogany table. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not offer a smug smile. I did not gloat over my mother's impending ruin. For decades, Evelyn had controlled our family narrative by speaking louder, moving faster, and burying the truth under layers of country club aesthetics. I had learned that to defeat her, I could not use her weapons. I had to use undeniable empirical data. I sat in silence, letting the irrefutable evidence of her forgery do the screaming for me. Evelyn's breathing turned ragged. She sensed the invisible walls of the trap closing around her, but her arrogance prevented her from accepting defeat. She opened her mouth, preparing to launch another volley of gaslighting, ready to invent a new lie to explain away the documents resting under the attorney's hands. She assumed she could simply talk her way out of the corner she had painted herself into. Mr. Davis adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning down toward the final paragraphs of the trust agreement, preparing to read the specific clause that would sever her last remaining hope. The silence in the conference room stretched thin, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. Evelyn recognized the danger of quiet rooms. For her entire life, noise had functioned as her primary mechanism of control. When confronted with an inconvenient fact, she simply talked over it, drowning the truth in a deluge of confident assertions and fabricated outrage. She stood taller, smoothing the front of her ivory blazer, and aimed her brightest, most condescending smile at the senior attorney. She informed Mr. Davis that the paperwork resting on his desk was a tragic representation of elder abuse. She claimed Lenora had spent her final months suffering from severe cognitive decline, hallucinating conversations, and forgetting the names of her own children. Evelyn declared that any trust document signed during that period was inherently invalid, a product of my cynical manipulation. She pointed a manicured finger in my direction, insisting I had coerced a confused woman into signing away the estate out of spite. She painted a vivid fictional picture of a frail widow being bullied by a tech-obsessed granddaughter who wanted to hoard the family assets. She demanded he throw the folder into a shredder and proceed with the authorized wire transfers because she was the rightful executor of the Davenport legacy and the only person acting in good faith. Evelyn operated under the assumption that legal boundaries remained flexible for people who belonged to the correct country clubs. She possessed a lifelong habit of skimming contracts, preferring to sign the signature line and rely on her social standing to shield her from the fine print. She believed her forged affidavit possessed enough aesthetic weight to bully a bureaucratic system into compliance. But Mr. Davis did not operate on country club aesthetics. He was an officer of the court bound by strict liability and empirical evidence. He ignored her entirely. He did not offer a polite nod or a sympathetic murmur. He kept his eyes locked on the heavy parchment of the Maryland Generational Land Trust, turning past the capacity evaluation and moving toward the administrative bylaws. He compared the dates on my medical evaluation against the timeline Evelyn had just invented. The disparity was glaring and fatal. His index finger traced the text, navigating the dense legal syntax that my grandmother and Mr. Gallagher had meticulously constructed 14 months prior. He reached the bottom of page 4. His finger stopped moving. His breathing paused mid-inhalation. Mr. Davis lifted his head. He took hold of his silver reading glasses, pulling them slowly from his face and set them down next to the forged affidavit. The professional deference he normally reserved for wealthy clients vanished, replaced by the stern, unyielding posture of a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. He looked directly into my mother's eyes. He told Mrs. Davenport she needed to sit down immediately. Evelyn blinked, her mouth opening. Another command, but the sheer gravity of his tone forced her into compliance. She sank slowly into her leather chair, the manufactured confidence draining from her posture. Mr. Davis picked up the trust document, cleared his throat, and began to read the fatal clause aloud, so the entire room could hear the exact parameters of the snare. The text was unequivocal. The property located at 14 Chesapeake Cove was strictly entailed under Maryland maritime preservation law. It existed within an irrevocable protective framework designed to block commercial demolition and maintain the historic integrity of the shoreline in perpetuity. Then came the specific penalty clause Lenora had insisted upon to neutralize her daughter's inevitable greed. Mr. Davis read the words slowly, articulating every syllable to ensure no ambiguity remained. Any attempt to bypass the trust, sell the restricted property, or forge dissolution paperwork by a non-trustee triggers an immediate fraud forfeiture. The penalty was comprehensive and brutal. It dictated that any party found attempting to illegally liquidate the estate would be instantly barred from receiving any other inheritance trust disbursements or residual financial benefits tied to the Davenport name. The clause acted as a tripwire. Lenora had not just protected the house, She had weaponized the deed. She knew Evelyn would attempt a clandestine sale, so she ensured the act of attempting the sale would trigger a permanent disinheritance. Evelyn sat frozen, her ivory blazer suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Her arrogance had been her own undoing. She had spent the last 3 weeks bragging to her social circle about her impending windfall, calculating how she would divide the developer's cash to erase Trent's debts and upgrade her own lifestyle. She had never bothered to read the actual probate filings or search for a recorded trust. She assumed her old revoked power of attorney functioned as a universal skeleton key. By submitting a fabricated sworn statement to the title company, she had unwittingly activated the exact legal mechanism designed to disinherit her. She had intended to steal a waterfront estate, and in doing so, she had legally incinerated every remaining cent of her inheritance. She possessed nothing. The reality of the situation permeated the boardroom, altering the atmospheric pressure. Trent swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his starched collar. He understood the arithmetic. Without the real estate proceeds, his overseas textile creditors and predatory lenders would begin seizing his retail inventory by Monday morning. The eviction notices would transition into padlocks on his storefront doors. He looked frantically toward the luxury developer, hoping the man might still offer a lifeline or a bridge loan to salvage the afternoon. Trent needed a miracle to prevent his country club peers from witnessing his financial ruin. The developer did not look back. He sat staring at the polished mahogany table, processing the catastrophic failure of his investment timeline. His heavy machinery crews were currently idling near the eastern shore, billing him by the hour for a demolition job that would never happen. He had expedited municipal permits for a property he could never legally touch. He had wasted weeks of labor and resources negotiating a transaction with a woman who held zero authority over the land. The developer reached out and gripped the heavy brass pen resting near his settlement ledger. With a swift, sharp motion, he slammed the pen down onto the wooden table. The sharp crack echoed through the boardroom like a gavel striking a sounding block. He pushed his chair back, the casters digging into the thick carpet, creating a physical distance between himself and the perpetrators of the fraud. He realized he had just attempted to buy a fraudulent title. The multi-million-dollar deal was dead, crushed beneath the weight of undeniable legal documentation. He would not be building sterile mega mansions on the Chesapeake Bay this year. But his fury was not directed at a lost development opportunity. His fury was directed at the specific financial exposure he now faced due to his own impatience. He had bypassed standard escrow protections to secure a fast-track demolition. He turned his head slowly, locking his gaze onto my brother. Trent shrank back into his leather seat, attempting to make himself as small as possible. The developer had wired a substantial, non-refundable deposit based entirely on a fabricated narrative. He demanded to know the exact status of those funds, introducing a terrifying new reality into the conference room. The luxury developer did not shout. Men who possess the capital required to reshape coastlines rarely need to raise their voices to exert pressure. He simply turned his heavy leather chair, locking his unblinking gaze onto Evelyn. His posture shifted from an impatient business partner to a predator who had just discovered a thief in his territory. He placed his hands flat on the polished mahogany table and demanded the immediate return of his $150,000 earnest money deposit. He instructed my mother to contact her financial institution, initiate a wire transfer reversing the funds, and provide him with the federal tracking number before anyone left the room. He expected his capital restored to his corporate account by the end of the business day. Evelyn swallowed hard, the muscles in her throat working against the sudden dryness. She turned her head, looking frantically toward the head of the table where my brother sat. Trent's skin had turned the color of damp ash. The arrogant, expansive bravado he had wielded so effortlessly at the Crab House just hours prior evaporated. He shrank back into his expensive tailored suit, looking like a cornered animal searching for an exit that did not exist. Trent attempted to deploy his trademark yacht club charm to diffuse the escalating hostility. He cleared his throat, but his vocal cords betrayed him, producing a weak, fractured sound. He stammered through a disjointed explanation about temporary liquidity constraints and diversified holdings. He claimed the earnest money was securely parked in high-yield short-term investments, insisting that releasing the cash would require a few business cycles to properly untangle the assets. He flashed a fragile, desperate smile, hoping the developer would accept his hollow financial jargon and grant him a grace period. The developer possessed decades of experience, dismantling underfunded contractors and bankrupt competitors. He saw right through the panicked facade. He leaned across the wide table invading Trent's personal space and asked him point-blank what specific financial vehicle currently held the cash. He demanded the name of the brokerage, the account routing digits, and the name of the portfolio manager overseeing the funds. Trent opened his mouth, but no words emerged. His eyes darted wildly around the sunlit conference room, desperately searching the nautical oil paintings and the frosted glass partitions for a coherent lie. A thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple, tracing the line of his jaw. He could not formulate a credible response because no investment portfolio existed. The developer understood the silence instantly. The money was not tied up in complex institutional instruments. It was gone. The capital had been vaporized to appease overseas textile suppliers and the predatory mezzanine lenders holding the eviction notices for my brother's failing retail storefront. The developer stood up, his heavy chair rolling backward across the thick carpet. He pulled a slim cellular phone from his sports coat pocket. He addressed the senior closing attorney, Mr. Davis, with a voice devoid of any professional courtesy. The developer announced that he would be instructing his own corporate counsel to file a civil suit before the county courthouse closed at 5 o'clock. The lawsuit would allege fraud, breach of contract, and intentional misrepresentation against Evelyn Davenport. He outlined his legal strategy with brutal precision. He promised to attach her personal primary residence, freeze her banking accounts, and seize any remaining liquid assets she possessed in order to recover his stolen capital. He assured her the discovery phase of the litigation would be swift, public, and financially ruinous. Mr. Davis shrank back in his seat, actively distancing himself from his former client. The senior attorney began gathering his pens and his legal pads, treating Evelyn as a radioactive hazard. He stated for the official record that his firm had relied upon a sworn affidavit submitted in bad faith, effectively terminating his representation of the Davenport family, effective immediately. He wanted no part of the impending federal fallout. The pristine socialite armor Evelyn had worn for decades shattered into jagged, irreparable pieces. The reality of her exposure struck her with unrelenting force. She was facing a highly publicized civil lawsuit that would be documented in the local Annapolis registry, visible to every affluent member of her exclusive social circle. Her son was fundamentally insolvent. Her anticipated inheritance was legally forfeited due to her own forgery. She possessed no financial safety net to catch her fall. The manufactured grace she relied upon to navigate her world vanished. Evelyn began to weep. These were not the calculated theatrical tears she routinely utilized to solicit sympathy at charity galas or maneuver out of social obligations. They were raw, ugly sobs born of genuine, unadulterated terror. Her immaculate makeup ran in dark streaks down her cheeks. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as the walls of her fabricated reality collapsed around her. She turned her tear-streaked face toward me, abandoning her posture of maternal authority. She reached her shaking hands across the polished oak table, her manicured fingers grasping at the empty air, begging me to intervene. She pleaded with me to dissolve the generational land trust, to sign over the waterfront property, and to save our family from the crushing weight of public humiliation. She promised we could split the real estate proceeds fairly. She offered frantic apologies. She did not mean desperate to reset the board and erase the devastating consequences of her own actions. She claimed she had always loved me, insisting that family must stick together when facing external threats. I remained seated in my chair, an island of calm amidst the cascading ruin. I did not feel a surge of vindictive triumph. I felt the quiet, steady satisfaction of a perfectly balanced equation. My grandmother had engineered this defense mechanism 14 months ago, anticipating this exact scenario with chilling accuracy. I had merely delivered the data required to activate the protective protocol. My family had destroyed themselves through their own unbridled greed, ensnared in a catastrophic financial liability they had built with their own hands. I stood up slowly from the table. I collected my certified deed, the medical capacity evaluation, and the public records detailing Trent's insurmountable debt. I stacked the documents, neatly aligning the edges with precise care, and slid them safely back into my heavy manila folder. I fastened the cardboard clasp. I looked down at my mother's trembling form. I noted her ruined facade and the frantic, pleading expression in her eyes. I did not raise my voice or offer an emotional rebuttal to her sudden declaration of maternal love. I spoke with the even regulated tone of a software engineer diagnosing a fatal flaw within a corrupted architecture. You can't debug a system by ignoring the errors. Mom, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the expansive suite. You owe this man $150,000. I suggest you start liquidating your country club memberships. I picked up my structured leather laptop bag and secured the strap over my shoulder. I turned my back on the frantic weeping and the looming legal threats. I walked toward the heavy mahogany double doors, pushed them open, and exited the conference room, leaving them to the wolves. The legal machinery of Maryland operates with a cold, unrelenting efficiency once the gears engage. It does not care about country club memberships or the thread count of your suit. Several weeks after I walked out of that mahogany conference room, the fallout settled over my family with a swift, brutal finality. The luxury developer did not issue empty threats. True to his word, his corporate counsel filed a civil lawsuit against Evelyn Davenport before the county clerk locked the courthouse doors that same Friday afternoon. The filings alleged fraud, breach of contract, and intentional misrepresentation. In Annapolis, public court dockets serve as the ultimate social currency. The moment the lawsuit hit the digital registry, the local journalists and yacht club gossips seized the data. Evelyn had spent decades curating a flawless facade of generational prosperity. She had dedicated her life to projecting an image of unassailable prestige, demanding deference from everyone she encountered. That meticulously constructed standing evaporated overnight. The social exile was immediate and clinical. The charity gala invitations stopped arriving in her mailbox. Her regular table at the waterfront restaurants was suddenly unavailable. The friends who had happily drank her vintage champagne at the Crab House suddenly found themselves too busy to return her phone calls. The high society ecosystem she had worshipped her entire life expelled her the moment she became a verified liability. Trent faced a much faster, sharper descent. Without the stolen real estate proceeds to buffer his negligence, the artificial dam holding back his creditors broke. The overseas textile suppliers and the predatory lenders moved in unison, executing their judgments with ruthless precision. The commercial landlord placed heavy steel padlocks on the glass doors of his flagship retail store on Main Street. The local sheriff served the eviction notices, taping bright orange paper over the polished mahogany storefront he had loved to show off. Trent's business accounts were frozen, his inventory was seized, and his luxury vehicle was repossessed from his apartment parking lot. The bespoke sailing apparel brand he used to mask his incompetence was liquidated to cover a fraction of his debts. He was reduced to his actual metrics, stripped of the aesthetic armor he had worn since childhood. He filed for personal bankruptcy, the public declaration of his failure cementing his ruin. To avoid facing severe criminal charges for the forged affidavit and the stolen earnest money, my mother had to make the developer whole. The developer demanded the return of his $150,000 deposit plus an exorbitant sum to cover his hourly legal fees and his wasted municipal permitting costs. Evelyn possessed no liquid capital to satisfy the settlement. The ironclad penalty clause in my grandmother's generational land trust had permanently barred my mother from receiving any residual inheritance. She could not borrow against the Eastern Shore estate, nor could she secure a traditional loan with a pending fraud lawsuit destroying her credit. The math offered only one viable solution. Evelyn was forced to list her own primary residence for sale. The elegant brick colonial home she had painstakingly decorated to impress her peers went onto the open market at a steep discount to secure a fast closing. She had attempted to sell her mother's history to fund a lie, and the direct consequence of that action was the loss of her own sanctuary. The proceeds from her home sale went directly into the developer's corporate accounts, leaving her with a shattered reputation and a fraction of her former wealth. She moved into a modest leased condominium on the outskirts of the city, far away from the harbor views and the sailing clubs she had once commanded. I did not attend the foreclosure auctions or track their relocation. I did not send gloating text messages or demand apologies. They were incapable of meaning. Revenge in its purest form is not a dramatic confrontation. It is the quiet, deliberate withdrawal of your participation. I simply removed them from my life. I blocked their phone numbers, filtered their email addresses into a deleted folder, and redirected my focus toward the people who actually valued my presence. I severed the cord, cleanly cauterizing the wound with the heat of the truth. I realized that arguing with their delusions was a waste of processing power. They had built their own cage, and I was under no obligation to keep them company inside it. 2 months after the aborted closing, I took a Friday off work and drove my sedan east across the Bay Bridge. The summer heat had finally broken, leaving the Maryland air crisp and thick with the scent of salt marsh and drying leaves. I turned onto the familiar winding road flanked by old-growth oaks, listening to the comforting crunch of crushed oyster shells beneath my tires as I pulled into the long driveway. The landscape had healed. The heavy diesel contractor trucks were gone. The neon pink surveying flags that had scarred the pristine lawn were entirely removed. The ground was unbroken, a sweeping expanse of green grass leading directly down to the deep blue water of the Chesapeake Bay. The black and gold luxury development sign had been pulled from the earth and discarded, erasing the threat of demolition. The 150-year-old maritime saltbox stood in quiet, enduring defiance. The imported slate roof caught the late afternoon sun, and the antique weather vanes spun lazily in the coastal breeze. The house looked exactly as it had when my grandmother was alive. It was a fortress built by shipwrights, a structure designed to weather severe storms and outlast the people who sought to dismantle it. I walked up the wooden steps, listening to the familiar groaning notes of the floorboards. I stepped onto the wraparound porch and settled into a worn wooden Adirondack chair facing the water. The environment was profoundly quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of the tide lapping against the stone bulkhead and the distant call of a heron gliding over the cove. I opened my laptop, resting the aluminum chassis on my knees. The screen glowed to life, displaying strings of clean, elegant syntax for a new software architecture project I was developing. I felt the steady, reliable rhythm of the code flowing from my fingertips. The data made sense. The logic was sound. Everything functioned exactly as intended, free from hidden errors or malicious interference. I reached out with my right hand and touched the old, weathered wood of the porch railing. The timber was rough and grooved from a century of salt spray and changing seasons. I traced the grain with my index finger, performing the exact same quiet ritual Lenora used to practice when we sat out here together. She had entrusted me with this specific view, recognizing that I possessed the precise skills required to defend it. My mother had spent her life evaluating people based on superficial status, measuring worth through designer labels and country club zip codes. She had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness, assuming my preference for data over drama made me an easy target. But true vindication is found in peace, independence, and the fierce preservation of authentic legacy. I did not just save a valuable piece of real estate from a wrecking ball. I preserved the unvarnished truth of our history. I proved that a foundation built on verified data and quiet competence will always withstand an assault built on arrogance and forged paper. The legacy my grandmother fought to protect remains unbroken, anchored firmly to the Maryland shoreline. The trap they set for me had sprung, but I was not the one caught inside. I sat on my porch listening to the bay water hit the rocks, and I went back to writing my code.
We spend our entire lives building monuments to our success, convinced that the ultimate measure of a life well lived is the inheritance we leave behind. In the landscape of modern American culture, where success is often broadcasted in curated social media feeds and measured by the square footage of our homes, this pursuit frequently mutates into a relentless race for prestige. We chase elite country club memberships, luxury vehicles, and the perfect holiday photograph, mistaking the glossy veneer of prosperity for the actual substance of a good life. But as the story of the Davenport family reveals, a house built on optics will eventually collapse under the weight of its own illusions. The true legacy we leave our children is never written in a bank ledger or a property deed. It is written in their character. When we examine the wreckage of Evelyn's choices, we are forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality about modern parenting. Evelyn loved her son Trent, but her love was a toxic, corrosive force. In her desperate bid to maintain the facade of a flawless high society family, she weaponized her wealth to shield him from the natural consequences of his actions. Whenever Trent stumbled in his business or personal life, Evelyn rushed in with a checkbook paving over his mistakes, silencing his creditors, and preserving his unearned status. She believed she was protecting him from the harshness of the world. In truth, she was slowly, systematically hollowing him out. This is the quiet tragedy of the golden child in so many traditional family structures. When parents continuously rescue their children from failure, they inadvertently strip them of the very experiences required to build emotional awareness and resilience. Trent was handed the world on a silver platter, yet he grew into a man who was fundamentally fragile. He possessed a dazzling smile and a tailored suit, but he lacked the internal fortitude to weather even the slightest storm. He was a hollow vessel, terrified of the judgment of his peers, relying on deceit and manipulation to survive because he had never been taught how to stand on his own 2 feet. His inevitable downfall was not a stroke of bad luck. It was the direct, unavoidable harvest of a childhood devoid of accountability. In sharp contrast stands Maris the daughter, who was pushed to the margins of her mother's affection. Evelyn viewed Maris's quiet nature, her practical career in software development, and her refusal to play the Annapolis socialite game as a profound disappointment. Yet it was precisely in those forgotten margins that Maris forged her enduring strength. Stripped of her mother's financial coddling and performative praise, Maris had to cultivate her own grit. She learned to navigate the world through logic, hard work, and unyielding self-reliance. Maris represents the profound power of emotional regulation and fairness. When confronted with the ultimate betrayal, the realization that her own mother and brother were conspiring to steal her grandmother's estate to fund a lie, Maris did not succumb to hysterics. She did not scream, throw wild accusations, or allow the sting of maternal rejection to dictate her response. Instead, she leaned into the wisdom of quiet observation. She gathered her data, insulated her emotions with reason, and addressed the crisis with a clinical, unshakable integrity. Her hands were calloused from the unseen work of building her own independent life, and those same hands were strong enough to dismantle a fraudulent empire without ever raising a fist. The contrast between these two siblings forces us to evaluate our own parenting values. What are we truly teaching our children when we prioritize appearance over authenticity? The Davenport saga highlights that true ethics do not reside in the zip code we inhabit, the prep schools we attend, or the designer labels we wear. Ethics are found in the quiet, unglamorous moments when we choose honesty over convenience and fairness over favoritism. If we wish to raise children capable of navigating an increasingly complex and demanding world, we must anchor them in the 3 fundamental roots of a life well lived: wisdom, ethics, and resilience. Wisdom requires us to teach our children how to see through the shallow allure of materialism. It is the ability to recognize that a historic beach house is just wood, glass, and location, while a clear conscience is an impenetrable fortress. Lenora, the matriarch of the family, possessed this profound clarity. She saw through her daughter's unbridled greed and her grandson's hollow vanity, and she used the unwavering truth of the law to protect her family's heritage. She understood that trusting the ethical child was the only way to preserve the legacy, teaching us that wisdom often means making hard, unpopular choices for the long-term good. Ethics demand that we model integrity in our own adult lives. We cannot expect our children to be honest if we construct our own realities on a foundation of polite deceptions, social climbing, and financial smoke and mirrors. Real family responsibility does not mean hiding a child's mistakes to save face. It means standing beside them while they face the music guiding them as they make amends. We must teach them that every action carries a reaction, and that a life built on deceit will inevitably crumble beneath them. Finally, resilience is the grueling necessary work of allowing our children to fall. We must give them the space to scrape their knees, to fail miserably, and to learn the bitter, vital lessons of recovery. Maris's quiet strength was not a sudden magical revelation. It was the slow accumulation of years spent relying entirely on herself. Parents must find the courage to say no to the easy way out, instilling in their children the bravery to stand against the crowd, even when that crowd happens to be their own flesh and blood. The greatest inheritance you will ever leave your children is not a multi-million-dollar trust fund or a pristine social pedigree. It is the launch pad of their character. If we as parents cannot shed our own vanity, if we refuse to curb our own materialism, we risk passing down a generational curse of emptiness. The sweetest vindication, the most powerful protection we can offer our families, does not come from ruthlessness or accumulated wealth. It comes from cultivating a steadfast, independent spirit that walks in alignment with the truth. Stories like these serve as a mirror reflecting the quiet fractures in our own lives before they have the chance to break wide open. If you resonate with these deep dives into family dynamics, psychological boundaries, and the quiet triumphs of the underestimated, please take a moment to subscribe and follow our channel, Fluffy Revenge. We explore the untold stories of resilience that happen behind closed doors every single day. As you look around your own home tonight, observing the quiet, familiar rhythms of the family you are raising, ask yourself what you are truly building. Are you laying a foundation of heavy stone rooted deeply in honesty, fairness, and emotional accountability? Or are you meticulously painting the walls of a fragile glass house, simply praying the storms never come? The children watching you today will eventually inherit the exact tools you hand them. The question remains, when the inevitable tempests of life finally arrive at their door, will they know how to rebuild, or will they only know how to hide in the wreckage?